This is the Panasonic Lumix gh6. It is the successor to the wildly popular gh5, and in this video we'll see if this $2,200 little tiny cinema camera is worth picking up for video. But first, a disclaimer. Panasonic is not sponsoring this video, but they did supply me with a pre-production gh6 for this review. That said, this video is supported by those who have purchased my camera guides and LUTs, and you can learn more about those down in the description. By the way, I will be producing a LUT pack and a guide for the gh6, and it's going to be huge because this thing is loaded with features which we're going to be getting into right now, starting with the new body design for the Panasonic gh6. The gh6 body is dust, splash, and freeze resistant, and if you compare it to the older gh5, you'll notice the gh6 is slightly larger in certain areas, and it does weigh a little bit more. One of the differences you'll notice when you pick up the gh6 is the grip size feels much better in the hands. Panasonic has taken the flip up and out design from the S1H and brought it to the gh6, and this is a great design. Every camera should have this style of monitor because it frees up your ports on the side of the camera and you can still rotate your screen. You can flip it up, you can just flip it out if you want. You have so many options, and it's just a great design. The screen also gets a slight dot count upgrade while the viewfinder remains the same as the gh5. Another huge difference is going to be the new cooling system on the gh6. So there's actually a fan, an intake and outtake vents. You can control the fan settings in the menu system, and there's now a menu system for temp control similar to what we've seen on Sony cameras. There are also more buttons on the gh6 compared to the gh5, and all but two can be programmed to do just about anything. There's new buttons on the front, top, back, EVF, and a new locking switch, which can be customized to lock any buttons on the camera. The gh6 gets a new battery with slightly different specs, but it does still work with the older gh5 batteries. Battery life is really good at about an hour and 15 minutes. That said, there are some record limitations if you're not using the new battery. Panasonic has also rotated the battery door, which means you can use larger video heads and plates without the battery door interfering. And on the bottom of the gh6, there is a new pin receiver for video tripod plates, which is great. The only thing I don't like about the body design is the grip where your palm rests is very slippery. So it really doesn't give you a lot of confidence when you pick up the camera with one hand. You feel very unstable right around that media door. And that brings us to media and IO on the gh6, where we have several upgrades compared to older models. In a future update, the USB-C jack on the gh6 will have the ability to record directly to external SSDs, which is nuts and a really awesome feature to see. That said, there are no details about what codecs and record settings will be compatible with this feature. The USB jack also supports power delivery for longer run times and trickle charging. USB recording aside, the gh6 also sports one SD card slot and one CF Express Type B slot, which is required for some record settings in the camera. And you can record to both cards simultaneously in either backup or relay mode. The HDMI jack is also seeing some upgrades and will be able to support up to 4K 120 frames at 120p via HDMI 2.1 and ProRes RAW on external Atomos recorders. Again, these features will be coming in a future firmware update. One issue I have with the HDMI output, however, is that when you turn on info display, your info is displayed over HDMI, but it disappears from the camera's monitor. This is a real shame, and I hope they address this in a future firmware update. Last but not least, the gh6 now gets a timecode BNC connector and a ton of timecode options. Then we start to get into the crazy stuff, resolution and frame rates. You can record up to 5.8K open gate at up to 30 frames per second, 5.7K up to 60 frames per second, 4.4K anamorphic up to 60 frames per second, 4K in multiple aspect ratios up to 120 frames per second, and HD up to 240 frames per second, and if you activate VFR, 300 frames per second. There's also 48 frames per second, which is really cool to see at all modes with exception to 5.8K, and all of this can be done in 10-bit without record limits and no overheating in my experience. While every single one of those settings have a 10-bit option, there are several that have 420 instead of 422 when it comes to chroma subsampling, but I would happily trade that for 10-bit color, which in my opinion is more important. As if that wasn't enough, compression and codec options on this camera are bonkers. For starters, the gh6 has 3 codecs to choose from: MP4, MOV, and Apple ProRes. That's right, ProRes 422, and HQ recording internal on the camera. At launch, ProRes is limited to 5.7K at 24 and 30 frames per second, but in future updates there will be more conservative 4K and HD options as well. Compression options are plentiful with either all intra or long GOP options in both H.264 and H.265. That translates to 58 different settings in the camera, which is just nuts. However, you can narrow down using a filter menu and create your own list, which is really, really nice. Now let's get to one of my favorite things about the GH6, and that is the sensor on this guy. The GH6 sports a 25.2 megapixel micro four thirds sensor with a native resolution of 5760 by 4320, but you have the option to record at several resolutions, aspect ratios, and crops if desired. Here are all the different settings and modes on the GH6, and it's important to keep in mind there are no forced crop modes, but you do have the option to turn on pixel to pixel when in 4K or HD, which will give you a 1.5 times and 3 times crop respectively. The camera can record at that native resolution of 5.8K or oversample to any resolution setting up to 120 frames per second. 240 frames per second settings are binned and 300 frame per second settings are cropped and binned. Now I know that smaller sensors like micro four thirds don't do it for a lot of people. However, when you start throwing a focal reducer on this camera, things change dramatically when it comes to your field of view and the amount of light hitting the sensor. Here's a comparison showing a stock GH6 up against two speed boosters. You can see we can get pretty large with that 0.64 metabone speed booster. In fact, if we compare all of the sensor crops to full frame and super 35mm, you can see that the GH6 with a speed booster gets you wider than most cinema cameras with a super 35mm sensor. There are also two anamorphic modes on the GH6, including the 5.8K open gate and 4.4K. And then we have one of my favorite settings on the camera, dynamic range boost. In short, this feature is similar to Canon's dual gain output on the C70 and C300 Mark III. When you turn this setting on, the camera will use two analog circuits to take two different exposures and output a higher dynamic range image. The result is incredible dynamic range in some scenarios with low noise. According to Panasonic, this bumps dynamic range up to 13 plus stops over the stock 12 plus stops when the setting is turned off. You can see from the waveform that the dynamic range boosted image has retained more information in the highlights, and when a log to 709 LUT is applied, we're able to retain our highlights. So far from my testing, turning this mode on seems to give you an additional 7 IRE of range before your highlights start to clip. That said, there are some limitations when using this setting. The first is your ISO range will now start at 2000. This is because the camera needs to utilize that lower ISO range to create this dynamic range boost. And the second is that you can only use this mode when filming at 60 frames per second or lower. I also found there wasn't much of an impact when filming in low dynamic range scenes. So I would avoid turning this mode on unless you know you need that extra latitude in the highlights specifically. If you do not use the boosted mode, the native ISO on the GH6 is 250 in Vlog. Another massive upgrade that the GH6 has is color and image quality. Just to give you an example of what we're dealing with, here is a shot of the GH5 and the GH5S, and here is the GH6. As you can see, immediately color looks so much better compared to those older cameras, and Panasonic has fixed the pinkish red skin tones. In the low light department, the GH6 holds up well for a micro four thirds camera and easily outperforms the GH5 and is only beaten by the GH5S at higher ISO levels. All of that said, this is not a low light camera, and as such, I would recommend staying as close to the native ISO of 250 or 2000 in the boosted mode. And then I would avoid going over 6400 to 8000 depending on your noise tolerance. Next up, we have rolling shutter, and I'll go ahead and show you a comparison with the GH5 and GH6. Things are looking pretty tidy here considering this is a much higher megapixel count, so that is going to play into rolling shutter. Then we have stabilization. The GH6 has up to 7.5 stops of stabilization, which is up from 5 stops on the GH5, and this uses the internal 5-axis dual IS2 system. I honestly don't have much to say here aside from Lumix is still the king of stabilization with these smaller sensors, and it just works incredibly well. You still have access to stabilization in anamorphic modes with customized settings for different D-squeezes. And now for the part that many of you have been waiting for, autofocus on the GH6 is still contrast-based DFD, but this is the first Lumix camera that I have actually been like, okay, autofocus works mostly. And I know that doesn't give you a ton of confidence, but just look at this footage of me using the camera with face and eye detection turned on. I was really surprised at how accurate and how responsive it was. And even when I interrupted or blocked my face, the camera seemed to be able to respond and recover, which I've just never had work this well on previous Lumix cameras. I think a big part of this is the new processor in this camera, which triples the speed of the autofocus system. So while it still might not be Canon or Sony, it is much improved. And this is the first camera I would actually feel somewhat confident turning autofocus on. Now it's not perfect and it still has those micro jitters depending on what you're filming, but so much better like the S1 and S5 where often the camera would just never get focus correct. The gh6 in my experience would eventually get there and it did a pretty darn good job. So long story short, unfortunately, still not a great camera when it comes to autofocus, but it is better, which is, I guess, better than nothing. In the audio department, we have several upgrades on the gh6, with the biggest being that you can now capture 4 channels of 96 kilohertz 24-bit audio on the camera. Channel 1 and channel 2 come from Panasonic's XLR unit, and channel 3 and 4 from the 3.5mm jack on the camera body. You can also customize how you want to monitor each of these channels through the headphone jack, and the gh6 has added standard and low sensitivity modes to help with hotter signals. On top of that, you can now set your input levels from -18 to 0, which is great. And there's a new function button to display all audio levels and settings in one tidy page. This is really slick and I'd love to see this feature on other cameras. Now let's get to overheating. I have not had any overheating issues on this camera, and that includes testing for a full day of filming 5.7K at 60 frames per second as well as 4K 120. After about an hour of filming, the fan would click on, but it would be very quiet and not disrupting at all. And at no time did I have overheating issues. And that was with the temperature setting set to standard, not high. But it is winter here in Illinois, so I wasn't able to test this thing in really high temperatures, but I feel pretty confident in saying that I don't think you'll run into issues given that you have complete control over the fan and can turn it up, as well as setting the camera to that high temp mode. Next, let's get to something that Panasonic is amazing at, and that is assist features. There's a ton of stuff coming from the older cameras. I'm going to focus on some of the new things found on the gh6, and we're going to start with the luminance spot meter. In short, it allows you to put a little box anywhere on the screen and get a meter reading in stops. As you move the camera, it will continue to read that spot, and you can turn it on and off while recording. Next, we have the vector and waveform, which has gotten an upgrade. You can now enlarge the waveform, which finally makes it actually usable on these smaller cameras. But for some reason, you can't turn it on and off when the camera is recording. This should be getting fixed in a firmware update. Another big upgrade to the gh6 is it's now compatible with dot cube LUTs. So you can use pretty much any LUT that you can find online. There are a ton of really great aspect ratio markers and recording indicators on the camera. Another big one is that you can now magnify while you are recording, check focus on your screen, and control how this works over HDMI, which is great. The gh6 now has a more video-friendly time-lapse options and assist tools in the menu system. We've got tally lights on the front and back with the option to control how bright they are, a cinema file naming system for including camera and card numbers and names, and the gh6 supports video tethering over USB where you can control focus, settings, and monitor multiple cameras using a desktop app. So that was a ton of information and features, and there will be more things coming to this camera over firmware updates, which is really exciting to see. But now let's get into the things I don't like about this camera, and there's a couple to go over. And the first is going to have to be that you can't display your screen info on both an external monitor and the back of the camera. While I like the overall design of the camera, I think it's a great mini cinema camera, the lack of any kind of material to grip onto your hand on the rear is a big problem. I don't feel confident when I pick this thing up with one hand. And the last con or kind of thing to consider really is the price. It's $2,200 for the gh6. Now that's fairly close to something like the Sony a7 IV, but they are completely different cameras. This is more of a cinema monster, amazing dynamic range, tons of assist tools for filmmakers, whereas the a7 IV is going to give you a larger sensor, better autofocus, but is, not really a cinema workhorse like this guy is. But at the end of the day, the Panasonic Lumix gh6 is, in my opinion, the best image capturing tool for filmmakers under $2,300 right now. Dynamic range, color, and codecs are fantastic on this camera. And if that wasn't enough, the huge list of resolutions, frame rates, assist features, and great form factor makes this a very worthy successor to the GH line and another huge hit from Panasonic. If you'd like to learn more about the gh6 or my upcoming guide for it, check out the information in the description. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you in the next video.